today. What do you fear the escalation of this conflict will be?
It's really hard to say because it looks like a situation that could very easily spiral out of all control. And that's because of the scale of the atrocities that we're seeing. We're seeing those reports coming out of Gaza. And we also just saw over the last few days what's been happening with the Hamas attack in Israel, which, as we know, it's 1,200 people killed, thousands injured, over 100 hostages taken, some very elderly, some very young, 2-year-old and 9-month-old reportedly. But it's not just that. It's not just the scale of the death, which is bad enough. It's the nature of it. It's the fact that it was such a slaughter, that the reports coming out of Kfar Aza and Kibbutz Be'eri are of bodies piled up in rooms where presumably people were rounded up and shot, of bodies being burned in the houses. And so that's what's making it so visceral and so traumatic, not just for Israelis, but also for Jewish people around the world. And then meanwhile, the retaliation in Gaza is utterly horrendous. I mean, people have been reporting from that region for some time. This is a strip that has been under siege for 16 years. By Israel. There's 2.2 million people living there. It's already experienced 5 wars, and people who've reported on them will tell you that this is way worse. It is unimaginably worse. Entire areas are being flattened. Entire families are being wiped out. And of course, as you've been hearing, Palestinians in Gaza have got nowhere to go. The borders are sealed. They are trapped in an unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. And the worst of all is that the international community has given Israel a green light to do this.
I mean, some would argue, some commentators have said that it's Hamas who've given Israel the green light to do this. Hamas have provided on a plate an excuse for Israel to take the strongest possible response here. What would you say to that?
I would say that we all know that this didn't start on Saturday. And what happened is appalling. Is absolutely appalling. The Hamas attacks were an utter atrocity. We have been looking at decades of Israel in a brutal military occupation of Palestinians who have been suffering violence, death, misery, and humiliation every single day. We're looking at a system that's been described as an apartheid system of control by several human rights organizations. And you know, Jane, because you've heard this year in, year out, you've heard people say what we've been warning about for years, which is, how could this ever have been sustainable? Why on earth would the international community have ever allowed Israeli governments to believe that this was sustainable, and not to end it, not only because it's an appalling lived experience for Palestinians who have to deal with this daily misery, but because it's not sustainable in terms of Israel and its own security. And I think that's the real tragedy, that Israeli leaders have been allowed to believe that this was ever possible. And we've seen that reality completely shattered over the last few days.
What impact do you think this is having on people that you know inside Israel? You know, there are lots of people living there who firmly believe in the two-state solution, believe, you know, that there could be coexistence. I would imagine that many people have had that belief shaken. Will existing divisions within Israeli society, do you think, now become more entrenched?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the reality is that for many years, it's not just the Israeli government that has shifted to a very far right position and is now an extreme right-wing government, which is partly the reason why the violence against Palestinians in the occupied West Bank has been so accelerated in the last few years. But it's also the population that has moved to the right. And that's the problem, that the population was also lulled into thinking that this status quo, where Palestinians experience misery on a daily basis in a way that's completely unsustainable, Israelis were also lulled into believing that that was sustainable. And it has to be said that, you know, when we look at what's happening in Gaza now and these kind of revenge, the need for revenge, sure, we can understand that. But what's the point? What's the outcome? What's the point of so many more Palestinians having to deal with this excruciating misery? What actually is the goal? Because again, we've been saying year in, year out that the only possible solution to this is a political one. The only solution is for the end of the occupation and for Palestinians to experience the same equalities and freedoms that all of us want and all of us long for.